initial program window, Photoshop's any of them. They're pretty similar all in all. So you can create a new project, open a project. You got this home screen which has all of our recent files that we've had open. And there's even a Learn tab with some nice tutorials that are worth taking the time. They're pretty short. I mean, five minutes a pop maybe, but they're nice. So, but back on the home screen, we can either open a project through our history, or we can create a new project. So I'm going to start by creating a new project. And this is what the interface looks like. So it's a simpler process than Premiere was to open and get up and running real quick. We had to create a file and save a file before we did anything in Premiere. After Effects works much more like Photoshop and some of the others from the standpoint of you can open it up and you can start a project, but it's not saved until you go and save it. So my first recommendation with After Effects is you open up a project, and the first thing you really ought to do is save it. So File, just like anything else, File, Save, whoops, that's the word. File, Save As. Cancel that. File, Save As, and find some place to save it to. So let's see. New folder, AE, Demo 1, and Demo 1. So the primary differences between Premiere and After Effects are Premiere is designed specifically to edit video. That's its primary purpose. And After Effects, on the other hand's primary purpose is to help you create motion graphics, animated logos, graphic type, animated type, any number of things like that. That's not to say, though, that you can't bring video into After Effects. You can, and we're going to do it. And you can, do keyframe animation and whatnot in Premiere, like we've done. But at least for motion graphics themselves, like I said, animated type, logos, all that sort of fun stuff, animated sequences, character animation, that kind of stuff, Premiere's not really suited for real well for most of that stuff. It just doesn't have the flexibility and the features to do it. So that's really the difference. When you've got a predominantly video-based project to do, Premiere is the choice. And when it's all motion graphics, Illustrator files, Photoshop files that you're animating, animated logos, title sequences, that type of stuff, After Effects is your initial starting point. So you can create a dynamic link between Premiere and After Effects. Just like we used Adobe Media Encoder to render video outside of Premiere, we can do our supers and our motion graphics in After Effects, and we can import them into Premiere, or create a live link between the two, so that if we're in Premiere, we can select an item, turn it into an After Effects composition, it'll open After Effects for us so we can work on it. When we save it, it's available right inside of Premiere. So the bottom line is Premiere and After Effects, we can dynamically link those two, which we'll do. And it does help stream workflow. I used to do everything in After Effects before I learned Premiere. Once I realized that Premiere really was better for doing video, I now work between the two programs. As a matter of fact, usually whenever I pull a job out of archive to make revisions to it for somebody, I still do the video, I still convert them, do the video portion in Premiere, and I bring in the compositions from After Effects into Premiere. So, and once I started doing that, it really sped up my workflow an awful lot. So, that is, creating the dynamic link between the two is a worthwhile thing to do. But we're going to start off just by focusing on kind of the interface and a couple of the basics, and then kind of get that out of the way. I do think, I mean, I'm working in the standard workspace. So if I take a look here along the top of my project window, standard is the one that's selected. So if you've got it open and you're kind of poking around at this thing with me, which I encourage you to do because I'm not going to do a project with this, but working with the interfaces while I'm doing it is a good way to get used to it. Because it is, I mean, it's different than Premiere. So it doesn't have the same stuff. It looks really similar, but it's not the same. So, so I'm in a standard workspace, and you should probably select that as well, just because all the basics are up here. So, standard workspace, and it looks like this. And it does look like Premiere. It doesn't look that drastically different, really. It does behave a little bit differently. So, but within the standard workspace, what I'll show you real quick is all of our tools in After Effects are located along the top of the app. Remember in Premiere, they were down on our timeline. They're along the top of the app. All of our workspaces are listed out here along the top as well, but we can still go under the window menu into workspaces and select a specific one, as well as create our own and save those workspaces. So I'm not going to go through creating and saving a workspace. It's the same as you do it in Illustrator and Photoshop, any other Adobe program. At least that process is exactly the same. But then pretty much everything else is After Effects specific. So all of our tools are at the top, workspaces here to the right on the top, and then for familiarity's sake, our project window is right here on the left-hand side, just like it was in Premiere, where we always work with it there. So our project window is on a tab, and right next to that are effect controls, which we'll look at later, but I'm just going to leave everything as it is right now. So project window, there's nothing there. Effect controls, and then in the middle is where all of our action happens. So this is our composition window. And in After Effects, we work with compositions rather than sequences. The naming is a little bit different. Conceptually, they're the same thing, all right? So we have sequences in Premiere. We've got compositions in After Effects, which is probably why you heard me refer to sequences as compositions in Premiere. I can't believe I didn't do that more than once. But compositions are in the middle, and this is basically our workspace. It's the equivalent of our artboard in Illustrator, our canvas in Photoshop. That's our workspace. And then to the right-hand side are, by default, our libraries, properties, panel, effects and presets, that kind of thing. So and the properties panel changes based upon the tool we have selected. So if I've got my type tool selected, I'll see type options in there. If I've got a rectangle, the primitive rectangle selected, I'll see those options in there. So it changes based upon the tool that we have. And then, much like Premiere, at the very bottom is our timeline. So, major difference in the timeline compared to Premiere is that if you recall in Premiere, whenever we'd create a new sequence, it would automatically create like a 10-minute long timeline, and we only worked in a really small portion of it. In Premiere or in After Effects, this timeline is as long as the composition that you need to make. So if I need to do a 30-second spot, or I need to do a 15-second video, or a 5-second animation, I want to create compositions that are those sizes, that are that long. It's not going to have all the extra stuff in it, all the extra space. It doesn't mean that I can't create a really long composition. I could create a 10-minute long composition, but we work with graphics themselves, we work with such a small piece that it's not very convenient to do that in After Effects. So in After Effects, our compositions are going to be just as long as they need to be. So we don't have a distinction in our timeline for audio channels versus video channels. It's all video. Or it's all just elements, actually. We can drop audio in here, but there's no separation between the two like we have in Premiere. So it looks the same, operates a little bit differently. All right? This is kind of the end of the bottom line there. So timeline area, we can adjust the width of all of our windows down here like we do everywhere else. We can resize all of these. I find After Effects a little more troublesome to actually grab them down here in the timeline than Premiere is, but it's just kind of the way it is. So, well, we'll get some stuff in there and then we'll kind of mess around with it and adjust it. So, anyway, that's our workspace. There's nothing predetermined about it. We're going to create things as we need to create them. So, if I want to create a new composition, which is the first thing I probably will actually want to, well, the first thing I probably really want to do is any assets I have, Illustrator files, Photoshop documents, I want to import. So if, let's see what I can find. If I've got an After Effects file that, well, I'll grab this one. So I can import an Illustrator file, I can import a Photoshop file, anything I need to. The thing that's in After Effects is that whenever I import something, we'll actually go through this in a little more in depth, but when I import something, the way I import it matters. Generally speaking, the options are, I almost always want to create a composition of whatever I bring in, at least if it's a layered Illustrator file. But I can import an object as a piece of footage, or I can create as a composition and retain the layer sizes. So footage will simply bring the file in flattened. Whatever the image, even if it's a Photoshop document with 20 layers in it, if I bring it in as footage, it's going to be one image, like I imported a JPEG file, for instance. But if I have multiple layers in an object, in a file, and I select composition, retain layer sizes, and open that, it's actually going to bring in my Illustrator file as a composition and all of the individual layers that are in it. So we'll spend a little more time with that, one of the first projects we do, because it's an important aspect, but I wanted to import something so I kind of had something to work with, and that's what I brought in. So I'll load up all of my assets. Again, just like Premiere, create a project file on your computer, give yourself an audio folder, a graphics folder, a video folder, a photos folder, whatever elements you've got, keep everything organized. Because just like Premiere, anything you import, if you go and move it later, or if you pull it out of your downloads folder, and then you go and clear out your downloads folder, it doesn't embed the stuff in the program. It simply creates links to it, and you'll lose those links. And especially once you're very deep into an animation, reestablishing those links is real problematic. So stay organized. It's one of the reasons I harp on it so much. Stay organized, keep everything in folders, keep your project with your assets, develop a good solid workflow that way. So this is our project window, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new composition. So I can do that one of two ways. Either this large block sitting here in my composition window, which isn't always there, by the way, or if I go over here to my project panel, look at the very bottom of it, create a new composition. It's a gray box with a couple of colored shapes inside of it. I can click on that as well. So it's either that or this. I'm going to click on the one in the project panel, and it brings up a composition window. And I'm always going to name my compositions. So maybe I know that this is going to be my, this is going to be a 15-second animation, my main composition. I'll do that. I've got some presets for sizes that I can select from. HD formats. I've got Ultra HD, 4K stuff, social media sizes, then some other HD TV and other formats. So I'll select the format I want, or I'll input the dimensions of what it is I need to work on. So if I'm doing a 15-second video, and I know it's going to be for TV, I'm doing a 1920 by 1080 HD. I can choose 24, 25, or 29 frames a second. Those are my options, by default anyway. So I can select those, or I can just put the dimensions in and change my frame rate on my own. So normally for video, we're going to do 29.9, 25, or 24 frames a second, one of those three. If we're doing like a cell-based animation, which we're going to look at, I might actually choose 24, or I might go down to like 12 frames a second, something like that. For video and motion graphics in general, 30 frames a second to 24 frames a second are the standards. If I'm doing cell-based animation, where I've drawn every frame, or I want to create a stop motion style of video, I might actually choose a 12 frames per second frame rate, something much lower. But in general, we're going to work with probably 24 frames a second, somewhere in there. So our frame rate, and then our time code and duration are down here. So if I know I want to create a 15-second video, and I'm just going to screen snap this and zoom in on it. If I zoom in on this, I've never had I can start my time code from any time period I want. I've never had a reason to change this. I've never found one. Sooner or later I will, I'm sure, but it's the exception and it's really not the rule at all. But duration does matter. So in our duration window here, the 21, as it is right now, are tenths of a second. 40, that's seconds, minutes, and then hours. So they're all separated by colons. So to the far right of the right colon is tenths of a second. then it's seconds, then it's minutes, and then it's hours. So knowing that, I'm going to change the 40 to 15 and the 21 to 00 and say OK. And that gives me my 1920 by 1080 composition, and my timeline is exactly 15 seconds long. So basically, that's setting up a composition. 15 seconds long, and this shows our window. Any questions so far on the composition window? Setting that up? All right. So let's take a look at our composition window. We've got some different things we need to be aware of here. So, I should turn those off. So here in the middle, this is our composition we're working on. And by default, it has a black background. So if I were to put something in here and render it, it would render with a black background. I personally feel like it's a bad habit to get into, leaving this black, just doing everything. I mean, it kind of, there's really nothing there. Whenever you render something out, it doesn't render transparency unless you're doing a special format. But it doesn't, in general, it does not render transparency. So it's got to do something. So it's going to render your background as black. So if I take a look down here at the options at the very bottom of my composition window, and I'll just screenshot these again. Basically what I have here is the set of tools I can work on in my composition window. So the first one, this 100%, this drop down on the far left-hand side, that's the view scale. So I'm looking at this at 100% of resolution based upon my screen's resolution. If I change that to 50, it'll change the view. So I can also change that view with Command minus, Command plus. And I can also do that with my magnifying glass tool. Not much different than most programs. So the first one is our view scale. The second one that says full is the resolution that we're viewing it on screen. So when you get a big After Effects file, what will frequently happen is, as you try to preview it, the RAM buffers can't keep up, and you'll get very slow, drawn-out kinds of playback. Skipping a lot, that type of thing. So if you're looking at it at 100% of scale at full resolution, that's going to be much more pronounced and much more prominent. If you start getting that kind of an effect when working with After Effects, it's skipping, it's jumping around, not behaving quite well, drop the resolution of it to half or to a third. If I'm looking at it at 100% of size, and I look at it and I set my resolution to half, what's on screen is still going to look really nice, beautiful, and clear, because it just has to do with the screen resolution and the way I'm viewing it. As I drop this resolution down, things within my composition, as I'm looking at it, might start appearing kind of soft and pixelated. It's strictly the preview on screen that you're looking at there, and that you're modifying with this resolution setting. This has no effect whatsoever when you go to render it. It will still render at full resolution, no matter what you have selected here. So, but this just kind of helps you in the workspace whenever you're creating animations to help make things run as smoothly as you can. So that's what those are. Taking a look across here, I'm going to skip this first one, but this is for fast previews. It clears out buffer and loads things up so they preview quicker. But the one right next to it here, this transparency grid, it's right here. If I toggle that, just like in Photoshop, I get a transparency grid. So I can either show it as transparency grid or I can show it as black, one of the two. The next one across is basically a bounding box. So when I've got a shape on the screen, if I draw a rectangle, this is on, and I see the handlebars around it. If I turn this off, well, it's actually the mask, but shape path, visibility. Usually you don't see the handlebars after toggling that back and forth. And coming across here, this last one, if I pull this up, this little one on the far right-hand side here, this will show my title and action safe. So we look at title and action safe in Premiere. We have them in After Effects as well. And the rest of it I'll leave for later. But this just has to do with how you're working, you know, within your display. Obviously, your title and action safes don't show up whenever you render. So, but I'll usually turn those on and leave them on, just so I can see where the center of my artboard is, and my composition, and that kind of stuff. All right. Vince, wake up. So, that's our composition window. And everything else is, our timeline's down here. I mean, that's the bulk of the interface, what we look at. So if I take a look, I'm going to do two things here. And then we'll move on to our in-class assignment. Like I said, I just kind of wanted to introduce it tonight. We'll do more with it on Wednesday, for sure. But I just kind of wanted to get the overview out of the way this evening. So anytime I add an item to my project, I can either do it through the objects that I've imported, or I've got, you know, shape tools up here that I can use, a pen tool, text, paintbrush, those kinds of things, so I can work with those primitives. I'm gonna create real quick a primitive shape. And I'm just gonna, actually, the first thing I'm gonna do is if I go to my, let's see, grab my selection tool. I'm gonna go to my layer menu, new, and there's a bunch of different objects that we can drop into our composition from here as well. So I can do text, a solid, lights, cameras. We'll look at 3D cameras later in the semester, but I'm just gonna add a solid because I don't like working with a blank background. So I'm going to add a solid, which is also Command Y on your keyboard. And it'll bring up this window that, you know, I'll just give it a name. This is going to be my background. And it'll by default pick up the dimensions of your composition. And then I can go down here and I can change the color of it. So I'm just going to create like a slate blue kind of background. Feel free to pick any color you want. Say OK. That gives my composition a background color. And generally speaking, unless I'm using this for my animation in some way or another, generally I'm going to lock this. So the first item in our timeline down here with all of our controls that are available, this padlock, if I click right next to that on that layer, I can lock that layer so that I can't click it and move it accidentally. So I'm going to lock my background layer. And a couple other things, actually more I guess stuff in. I can also turn the visibility of this layer off, which is the little eyeball on the far left-hand side. So if I click that eyeball, it toggles the visibility of the object. And I'll go back to the other ones whenever I have a couple other items in my composition here. So I've got a background. That's great. I'm going to go to up here to the top menu, and I'm just going to select an ellipse. Do an ellipse tool. And I'm going to purposefully draw an ellipse. If I hold down my shift key, that'll constrain it to a circle. I'm just going to draw a circle up here off center. And I put it there for a very specific reason. When you draw objects using either the primitives like rectangles, the ellipse, pen tool, or whatever else, it places a path with fill and stroke on it within the, I'm trying to think of the right word, within the region of the entire composition. And when it does that, this is just one shape up here. It actually places the center point for this object right at the very center of our composition. So if I were going to decide to rotate this, I'll go up here and grab my rotate tool and grab a corner of it and rotate it. Look how it's rotating it. It's rotating it around the center of my composition rather than the center of the object. That anchor point that it places in the very middle, any transform that I try to apply to this, whether it's a rotate, a scale, position, whatever it is going to perform that action off of that anchor point, that center point. So knowing that that's there is kind of important. It's also kind of important to understand why it does that. So with this object selected, this is my shape layer. I could go and grab, let's say I grab a rectangle. With that shape layer selected, I can draw a rectangle on my screen, and I can draw another one down here, and maybe a tiny one right here, something like that. As long as I had that first shape selected, it draws all of these other shapes inside of that shape layer. So if I look down here on my timeline and close this up, shape layer 1 contains all of these objects. And if I open it up, here's all of those individual shapes that I drew. So if I'm going to put multiple shapes within that shape layer, it now kind of makes sense that if I grab my rotate tool again and rotate this now, of course, that I can rotate all of those objects within my composition. May or may not be what I want, but that's why it does it. All right? I'm going to guess most of the time, actually in my own case, this is hardly ever the case. I usually do not nest different shapes under one shape like this, but that's the way it works. So if you're drawing multiple shapes on the artboard or on the canvas, the composition, I'll get my terms right sooner or later, as long as that first one's selected, it's going to draw all the subsequent ones underneath it. So I'm going to delete all those. Go grab my ellipse again. Usually when I do this, I want a separate layer for every object that I draw so that I can manipulate them individually. So I'm going to name the shape layer. If I select the layer and I tap return on my keyboard or enter if you're on a PC, this is my black circle. I'm going to give that a name. And remember that my center point or my anchor point is set to the center of my composition. So I want to change this, and I can do that a couple of different ways. What I generally want to do is put this anchor point in the middle of the object that I'm working with. So if I come back up here to my tools bar, and there's this little snapping option. If I check that box, make sure it's turned on, then I could come over here to my tools. This pan behind tool actually moves my anchor point. So if I click on this tool right here, come down here, click on this anchor point and drag it over to the circle, I can snap it to any place I want that center point to be. So I'm just going to snap it right to the middle. And then if I select go back over here now and select my selection tool, now I can drag this around, and if I decide to rotate it, it's going to rotate on that center point the way I want it to. So the first kind of big thing is always know where your anchor point is at. Because on Wednesday, when we start looking at principles of animation, and we start tinkering with those a little bit in After Effects, we're always going to want to know where that anchor point is. And I find with most people when they're first learning After Effects, it's like the last thing on their mind, but it needs to be one of the things near the top, knowing where that's at. So, with my snapping on still, I can go ahead and slide this. Maybe I grab my selection tool, slide this to the middle of my artboard so I can center that object up. And if I take a look at, just real quick, if I take a look at my properties panel, my black circle, I can see all of my transform options as well as shape properties directly beneath it. The layer contents will give me access to the size, stroke width, those kinds of things. So we'll look at those more later too, but there are multiple places to find that. I can also come up here to my toolbar, and here's the fill. I could change the fill on this by clicking on the shape, the color right next to it. I could change it to maybe a dark blue. I could give it a white stroke, and the stroke width is sitting right next to that. So similar to, anytime I work in Illustrator or whatever, I got access to all that stuff. Thank you. A little lower, can you go a little lower? Beautiful, thank you. So those are our primitive shapes, which we'll use for a lot of different things. But And having a shape like that on the artboard is also good for this last point, which is, let's take a look at the shape down here in our timeline. So this is our black circle. And if I open this up, if I look out here next to this is my first layer, there's a little arrow out here next to it. If I click on that arrow, it opens up the options for this shape. Anything I put on my artboard is going to have, the contents is going to vary, but they'll all have a transform section. And if I turn the arrow down next to that, you'll see I've got anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. So these are standard basic transforms. Every object will have the transforms. Contents will vary. For my shapes, I've got this ellipse, and if I open that up, I've got options for my stroke, my fill, my transforms, on the ellipse itself, as well as things I can do with the path. So on type, contents actually doesn't read as contents, it reads as, if I grab my type tool, I type the word type, move it over here, you'll see that my properties panel changes. Change the color of it. But down here under type, if I open up that window, that little arrow, I've still got the transform option, just like my circle, but instead of contents, I've got text, which gives me options for my type element. So the contents of each of these layers do tend to vary based upon what the object is, but they all have a transform section, which is what we're going to concentrate on, focus on more on Wednesday than anything else. With my layers, I've got 3 layers in here now. It's a hierarchical kind of a thing. Whatever's on top is going to appear on top. Whatever's on bottom is going to appear on bottom. So you need to reorder these. You just need to drag the layers around. But I can lock any of those. I can show or hide any of them with our little eyeball. And this little dot right next to an object is actually kind of the reverse of the eyeball thing. This dot is called a solo. So if I come down here and here's my type, for instance, if I click the dot on my type, next to the type, the only thing that shows on my canvas or my artboard is my type. It hides everything else. It's kind of the reverse of show and hide. If I click that dot again, everything comes back. Click the dot on my black circle, that's the only thing that shows. So when I get 20 to 40 different elements in my layer panel here, and I just want to work on a single one, I can hide everything else by clicking on the solo object. For warm weather comes the big black ants. Great. So that's the solo object. And then we're going to take a look real fast here at this, and then I'm done. So this is my 15-second composition. Remember when I created a composition, I made it 15 seconds long. And just like in Premiere, we can magnify our timeline. So the top skinny gray bar with the blue ends on it will magnify our timeline. So if I click on the end of it and I drag this in, you'll see that I can magnify it down to, there's 2 frames, 4 frames, 6 frames, 8 frames. If I scale this up, it goes 12 frames a second, 12 frames 2 seconds. If If I slide this all the way down, I can look at individual frames all the way through my timeline. Getting to know this time magnification is more important in After Effects than it was in Premiere, except for the fact that we work with such a long sequence most of the time. But a lot of times when we animate, we're not animating in terms of seconds. We're animating in terms of tenths of a second, frames, you know. Most animations, the things we try to animate happen very quickly. They're not slow. So we're frequently zooming in and looking at a couple of frames to every frame, one of the two. So that's time magnification. And the gray bar right below the timeline is our trim bar. So if I tap the space bar on my keyboard while I'm down here, you'll notice this blue playhead right here, like we had in Premiere. Tap the space bar, and it'll play through the entire 15 seconds of my clip. Tap it again, and it'll stop it. But if I go to this trim bar, clip on the end of it, and drag it all the way in to say 2 seconds. Now when I tap my space bar, it's going to play to the end of the trim bar and start it over again. And again, when we start animating elements, this is something else we do. Or I guess I should say something else I do, and I'm going to encourage you to do, because the best way to get a sense for whether something is timed correctly is to watch it over and over again. And sliding your trim bar down to the space that you're working on allows you to view it over and over again. So that's our trim bar and our time magnification. I can also slide along to different points in my timeline, but that's what those are. So save that file. And that's our very quick introduction to the interface and working with a basic element in After Effects.